the honour is entirely mine. And the idea that I would be a colleague, I've never taken a picture in my life and never will, because having been surrounded for 14 years by the Magnum photographers, that's something you very quickly give up, because I'll never ever match what they do. However, I have known Philip a very long time, and I'm really pleased and honoured that he asked me to introduce him tonight. He did, of course, say, Brigitte, the only thing you need to say, I'm a mad Welshman who happened to go through Vietnam and liked the girls. I thought maybe that was a bit short, Philip, so I am actually going to elaborate a little bit. Though that was genuinely what he wanted me to say. Philip does come from Wales, and was Welsh-speaking, is Welsh-speaking, and it is true that he studied pharmacy, and that he worked in Boots. He worked in Boots at night, and then during the day he took pictures for The Guardian. He was born in 1936, and in 1961 he gave up Boots and being bored, as I understand, and freelanced for full-time for The Observer. In 1962, Philip covered the Algerian War, went to Central Africa and to Asia. Well, he was in Vietnam from 66 to 71, and he will be much more eloquent than I am about what he did there and the work he came back with. I just want to say, because he won't say it himself, that if people ask you, is there ever a photography book that changes the course of history? Well, my answer always is, and I think the only answer that I know is Vietnam Inc., because it did really change the way that people looked at that conflict. And it's very interesting, I'm no longer with Magnum, I'm now with LCC, where we've recently taken in the Kubrick archive. And of course, when we went to the Kubrick archive and looked at the research material for the film that Kubrick did on Vietnam, a very well-thumbed copy of, and a nearly broken copy of Vietnam Inc. was there, which was a nice thing to see. And Philip can tell you much more about that. In 1966, Philip became an associate member of Magnum, a long convoluted thing to become a member of Magnum, which I won't go into here now, but in 1971 he was certainly voted as a full member. Went in 73 to cover the Yom Kippur War. From 73 to 75 he was in Cambodia, then based himself in Thailand. But in 1980 moved to New York, where he not just became extremely active within the running of Magnum, he was actually Magnum's president for 5 years. Philip has had assignments, we think in 120 countries, but it could actually be more. Clearly, this body of work, Vietnam and Cambodia, have always and will always be central to him and his work and what he stands for. In the Magnum book that I was asked to edit, one of the things that we write in the biography of Philip is that though human foolishness attracts him, he still believes in human dignity and man's capacity for improvement. I think, given all the current debates about photojournalism and where photography is going, that's actually a very important line. But I want to quote something else that Philip said to me this week, which is, as you probably know, certainly if you saw the big piece in The Independent on Monday, that Philip is not very well. And he said, but the spirit is great. Brigitte, it's a little bit like as if you have the most expensive motorbike in the world and you're on top of it, but the tires are a bit flat. Please be as honored as I am that Philip is here and that he will talk to us about his work. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm afraid one tire doesn't exist and the other one is very flat. So that explains why I'm not standing up. However, I feel a great sense of achievement. Thanks to an Iron Bevan's oxygen national health system, I actually got up those stairs much, much quicker than any doctor predicted. Well, it's wonderful to see you all here. If I get a little breathless now and again, it's either because I'm attempting to crack a joke. In fact, you might say it only hurts when I laugh. But the thing is that we might keep I will attempt to keep the hilarity to after looking at the pictures, because, you know, I feel incredibly privileged to have, in a sense, did I choose Vietnam? Did Vietnam choose me? I can't remember. But I remember in the middle of '66 being somewhat bored, and I believe in boredom. Boredom is a great motivator. Boredom is what gets you up your ass and out there and doing things. And in '66, I just felt I had to escape, because I'd been working a lot for the color magazines that they were great in those days. But there was a kind of formulaic approach. I was tired of doing stories on transit visas. And so I decided that rather than spread wide and shallow, I wanted to get a little more narrow and deeper. And Vietnam was my baptism, in a sense. And I think that the reason why I'm, well, proud, I suppose, or at least privileged to have been involved in what happened there, is that we have so much to learn from what happened. I think that if all of those guys in Washington had read more about Vietnam, the right kind of books about Vietnam, we wouldn't be in Iraq and Afghanistan today. They. So that I think that we have a lot of lessons to learn, not just about war and killing people, but we have a lot of lessons to learn from the way in which social systems, economic systems, are inclined to take over the world, hegemony, if you like. And I believe that the lesson, if you like, of Vietnam is something that should be uppermost in all our minds. So we'll start looking at a few pictures. This is a picture that I started the book off with, in a sense, only because, you know, he's an older guy, he's lonely, the girl shows that disdain. And I think when you're tackling big subjects, the iconic image is often one that's important. And the use of children by these are the South Vietnamese army. It's just extraordinary that, well, to me anyway. I cannot be assuaged by the information that the word infantry comes from infant. I didn't know that, but certainly it's something that I personally found deeply offensive. Now, a lot of the Americans who killed Vietnamese never saw the Vietnamese they were killing. This is an aircraft carrier in the South China Sea, and those guys would, you know, fly up the carrier, bomb the villages, and essentially come back home. Although I did notice they quite often just find it a bit too rough, and they went to a base on the mainland so that they could go to the brothels. And this is what it was all about, you know, the extraordinary killing of Vietnamese that took place. And in this case, you know, his sister, his big sister, had just been killed, and the boy was distraught. And of course, every time I look at this picture, I think of the words of General Westmoreland, otherwise known as General Westmoreland, the American commander who came up with an incredible quote saying, you know, the Orientals are not like us. They don't have the same feelings. You know, they're not somehow as sensitive to death as we are. And this, despite many a kind of accusation by certain journalists that this is all happening in my bedroom, and that's me on the left. It was in fact being watched by a couple of hundred people, including a lot of Vietnamese children, as this woman was being somewhat ravished by. The implication that is me, which it doesn't even look like me, but you see, the military wore shorts, were long sleeves, and people like me would wear short sleeves. And the reason is that he's what they call a SEAL, and these were the SEALs were the Navy's special forces. We called them the piano wire merchants. They would creep up behind Vietnamese with the old piano wire and garrote them at night. And they were usually quite small Americans, so they could blend in with the locals. And this is one of those examples where the Americans were using rocket fire, and they developed this new kind of rocket which used high-density plastic instead of lead, so that it wouldn't show up on X-rays. So when you come to attempt to save someone's life, a lot of surgeons are involved, and you don't know where, you just don't know where the bits are. So that it's a very, from a military point of view, of course, it's reckoned to be a pretty effective way of well, neutralizing the enemy. And this is one of those, well, Phil, you always carry a headless doll in your camera bag. You know, journalists can, they could be so cruel. but this is actually, believe it or not, a real firefight. Outside, in the book, you'll see that outside this window there was a canal full of soldiers trying to get back to our position. And a few seconds after this picture was taken, the Viet Cong fired a rocket into the house. It had a delay on it, meant to explode inside and kill everyone. But he was a little off, and it went just under the floor. There was a muddy bank outside. So the whole house collapsed, but nobody was really hurt. And this, one of the things that obsessed us all that time we were there was, you know, where were the Viet Cong? We never saw them. We had problems sort of finding them. It was very, very rare to actually photograph someone working for the other side. Of course, the beautiful man who worked for Time magazine was working for the other side. I knew that the moment I met him. He was the politest Vietnamese I ever met. But the truth is that to actually get pictures, and here was a captured guy, you know, they roughed him up, but undoubtedly he would end up being killed. And there's a bit of a story on this one, which involves Magnum. The whole story takes too long to tell. What actually happened was he killed some of our guys, and our guys killed him. Anyway, Magnum rang up and said, Saatchi and Saatchi want to know whether they can use the picture as a recruiting poster for the British Army. Now, that's the great thing about being in Magnum, I have to say, that they do check. You know, they don't sort of go ahead. It's not the other agencies. And I said, look, they're out of their minds. You know, are you kidding? I'm a pacifist. I'm not going to tolerate any nonsense like that. So Saatchi said, oh, don't worry, we'll just recompose the picture. So they found a guy delivering Chinese food and lay him on the ground, took a picture with his mouth open, and they got all the other recruitments and they put the picture together, and they ran the ad, and we sued the shit out of them. But it was much more important than the money was the fact that it appeared in the Guardian and the Standard and stuff. There was a lot of publicity about it, and maybe that's what drove him towards half sharks, or whatever he's into now. I'd like to think so anyway. And this is, you know, once again, I'm working on my next big book, which is on Cambodia. You know, I've been photographing it for 40 years. And every now and again, you know, you're always looking for that sort of iconic image that says it all. And in this case, you know, that's, I suppose, in some ways, I came close with this one. Now, this is another one of these stories. Coppola's film, Apocalypse Now, he took, this guy, this is a Viet Cong who had been fighting, and he had a stomach wound, and he put his intestines in his stomach, in a woman's, a family's washing up bowl, and strapped it around his middle and kept fighting. So we captured him, and you don't see it in the picture, but the Vietnamese was saying, oh, him VC, him Viet Cong, he can drink dirty water from the paddy field, because with a stomach wound you get terrible thirsts. And the guy on the left said, look, anyone who can fight for 3 days with his stomach hanging out can drink from my canteen any time. I was very proud of this picture in a way, because I have never, okay, there were some bad GIs who did terrible, terrible things, but for the most part they were kids who were confused, and they were not the enemy. And so, to me, you know, they were worthy of respect. Anyhow, Coppola reenacts the whole scene with my caption, and I was the only one there, you know, in the movie. Magnum tracked him down, said, you know, you can't do this, this is plagiarism, you ought to pay something. He replied with the immortal 2 words of Hollywood, sue me. Put the phone down. Anyway, still the greatest film made, I think, on, I can't say that anymore, can I? Full Metal Jacket wasn't bad either. But I think, I don't like I don't know if you guys are movie buffs, but suddenly the first film of Kubrick's, you know, the original, I think was far more powerful than some of these remakes where they put in all the outtakes. And I think what Kubrick did was, Coppola did, was to capture very much the madness of that war, because there were aspects of it that were totally and utterly, you couldn't make it up. And the real significance of this picture is that this is the bit of Saigon where all the pro-American Vietnamese lived. And thanks to its superior, not military tactics, but the mental tactics of the Vietnamese communists, the VC, it was all destroyed. So these are the people who'd really gone with the Americans. In a sense, they really believed in them. And that's why the Vietnamese, the other side, if you like, the VC won in the end. You know, the Americans had the smart bombs, but the Vietnamese had the smart minds. And that's what counts in any conflict. And this was one of the saddest things I photographed. This little boy had been in his mother's arms when she was killed by helicopter gunfire. He went mad, ended up in this orphanage, which, of course, happened to be next to the airport where helicopters took off every few minutes. So he spent most of his time trying to cut the noise of the helicopter out. And this, once again, you know, is to me the iconic image. The tag says it all. It was obviously filled out by a man who was sympathetic to, or anti-war, put it that way, because it says VNC civilian, and that was absolutely forbidden. Any wounded Vietnamese was VCS, Viet Cong suspect, and any dead civilian was immediately posthumously elevated to the rank of VCC, Viet Cong confirmed. And in the end, all you have to remember about the Vietnam War, you know, there are so many books, millions of books, well, hundreds of thousands anyway, been written about the Vietnam War. And there are even books, How We Won the Vietnam War by the Americans. I mean, it's extraordinary, the revisionist historians that can be paid essentially to say whatever Washington wants them to say. But all you have to remember is this: in Washington there is a monument to the dead Americans. It's 150 yards long. If the same monument was built to the dead Vietnamese, the same density of names, it would be 9 miles long. That's what that war was about. That was about genocide. That was about, the body count. How many can we kill today? It was a slaughter. It was mass slaughter. Okay, so we're now going to get to the next bit, which is the Agent Orange is in here, I think. So this is well. So after the war was over, obviously, you kind of want to go back. You want to see what's changed. You want to see how things are progressing and how they're managing. And I have been back to Vietnam, I think it's now 26 times since the end of the war. As someone said, well, he's always a war photographer because he keeps going back when the war's over. And this was a celebration parade, This was another celebration for the end of the war. I shot it for Life magazine. They only published this picture, and I think the second guy from the left was meant to be there as, how kind of ridiculous he looked with his ill-fitting suit and dragged down by all those medals. But I think most Americans would say, Jesus, if we lost against this guy, we don't have a chance. And I like this picture, and I suppose had I done a vertical book, well, that might have been the cover, I don't know. And the desolation, the bombing of the North, if you know your history, the Americans never went north by ground. They simply bombed the North. And in the end, the pilots would complain they were just making the rubble bounce. The amount of bombing is so extraordinary. There was really nothing left, and this is obviously the remains of some building I found. There's some kids who were, although they're not actually doing anything in the picture, they were there to keep the birds away from something someone had planted nearby. All the schools in the North had these trenches for the kids to jump into because, when the bombers came, you got where you could. And this picture, it's one of those, point pictures. I suppose the inventiveness. This is probably 1980, and 5 years after the war's over, and this woman mixes her own ink, and she's refilling ballpoint pen refills with a syringe, and that's in a sense, there's a blend of desperation plus inventiveness, which always impresses you when you go to Vietnam. There's nothing those people can't do. I mean, I'll put it another way. Why would a 200-year-old country want to load it up over a 5,000-year-old country? Well, they're doing the same thing in Iraq. And this is what Vietnam, the south part of Vietnam looked like because of the Agent Orange that had been sprayed everywhere. And this is the famous path at My Lai, where a bunch of Americans, those are the bad guys. Not all bad, One guy shot himself in the foot so he didn't have to partake in it. Another guy landed a helicopter and told his gunner to fire at the Americans if they didn't stop killing these women and children. And the My Lai massacre, they killed 503 people before breakfast, mostly women, children. And Cali was the guy considered mostly responsible. And he, in fact, he went on during his trial, said, you mean you threw babies in the air and shot them? And he said, yes, sir, on the way down. I said, you know, I mean, it's extraordinary what some people did that particular morning. And when this picture was published in Geo magazine, needless to say, some Canadians saw it, fell in love with one of these little children, and went back later and married her. But there's no prize for picking which one. And this is a relatively small bomb. You know, it's about a 500-pounder, and it didn't go off in this village. You see, they were reduced in the end to just, I mean, basically bombing straw huts. And when the Americans pulled out in '75, they left behind a lot of their junk. And these planes are actually very valuable. I think they've since been sold, these C-130s. But it's always a very sort of Vietnamese scene then. And of course, the scrap metal left behind by Americans was, you know, the actual volume was amazing. It seemed at one time that, you know, half the population of Vietnam were collecting scrap metal, and these were valuable because they're brass, and it all ended up in this sort of huge junkyard in Saigon. Now, the Vietnamese, as you know, are Confucian, and Confucians are inclined to think in terms of circularity. So they are turned on by the idea that the American pilot would drop his bomb, blow something up, the scrap metal from the bomb would come here, would be shipped to Japan, made into a Japanese car, sent back to America, and the pilot would drive the car. That, I think, is the closest a Confucian could get to an orgasm. And, you know, this is, the tragedy here was so enormous. This wonderful guy and his father there. And I'm sorry, you know, by the way, just in case it passes through your mind that I had some sort of central casting to get the kids to stand in the window. I don't pose pictures. I've never posed a picture in my life. You know, I don't do that kind of photography. And what happened in this case was that he had been farming. He's got a little garden. It's not very big. It's as big as this room. But there was a mine in it, and the mine is valuable. So he was saving it as a sort of an old age pension, if you like. And the third time he moved it, it went off, severed his optic nerve, blew his hand off. And this is still happening today. And the worst of all are the cluster bombs. And even a week ago there was an item about cluster bombs in which the Americans are still saying, no, valuable weapon, we can't have them banned. This is the most inhumane weapon ever imaginable. They even paint them bright colors so the kids will pick them up and blow themselves up. And this was one of those wonderful assignments that Magnum got me. There was this man who claims to have been the most highly decorated Vietnam veteran. And his name, of course, was Christian. And as soon as he got to Vietnam, he hired a camera team to film his every movement. And I was photographing for a magazine. And of course, you know, he kept taking that shirt off over and over and over again, like some sort of, and handing out 10/8 glossies to everybody, like some ailing Hollywood film star with all his medals on. And I mean, his bio, which I can't get it confirmed, but his official bio is that, you know, with nothing more than a knife between his teeth, he ran into machine gun positions and killed everyone. And this was, once again, you know, horrible but lovely. She was napalmed. The little girl lost her family, so she adopted her, and, you know, she's her daughter. And the things, excuse me, In Vietnam Inc., I have a great quote from a guy who says, God, we love those backroom boys at Dow Chemical. You know, the first napalm, the gooks could scratch it off them if they were quick. But then we put polystyrene in there to make it stick better. And then they said, but they could jump underwater and it would go out. So then we put in Willie Peter, white phosphorus. And that means that even if you get a small amount on you, that white phosphorus will get into your system and the phosphorus will kill you. And there are human beings on the planet Earth who are actually doing this for a living. You know, that's what they do. They work out how to make weapons that are really there, you know, to burn people. I mean, this is hell on earth. And it was, needless to say, it was rare to find survivors, frankly, that had been that badly affected. And this, of course, is one of the iconic images on newspaper, Eddie Adams' picture of General Bullseye Luan, as I prefer to call him, murdering this guy. And you know, my Fleet Street training was, I was rather proud of it because, you know, I would say to the editor of the Observer, look, you know, it's not, you know, we don't do the obvious. We go at things tangentially. So I asked someone, I said, you know, was he married? And he said, yeah, you know, he had a wife. So I tracked her down, and she had his medal and the cutting from the paper. And, you know, she started to cry. And to me, you know, that's good. Okay, now we come to Agent Orange. Now, you know, everybody in this room may know everything about Agent Orange, but basically the Americans dropped this defoliant called Agent Orange, and in it was dioxin. And dioxin is probably the most harmful substance when it comes to human beings, human health. And of the many, many conditions it causes, fetal damage is one of the most important, the most disastrous, the most psychologically, you know, the vulnerability of the pregnant woman. And in Vietnam, the moment that, assuming the fetus comes out, you know, most of them are born, some come out as a mass, and you know, the miscarriages and so on. But still, if there is a live, what in the West we would call a live birth, the first thing that woman says in Vietnamese, is it all there? You know, that's, and they're still being born every day. Every day they're being born. And they're being born because ultimately, well, here it gets a little bit on the complicated side. There are two possibilities. There are a lot of hot spots where there are areas in South Vietnam that are very, very contaminated, and it's possible that a lot of it is recontamination. However, there is an equal amount, or an overwhelming amount of evidence, especially from the north, which was not sprayed, but men who came south to drive those trucks down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, when they went back, having had perfectly normal babies with their wives, suddenly had deformed babies. And the deformed babies, if they survive, and some can get away with it, and they're almost normal, they in turn have deformed kids, so it passes from generation to generation. And that was the second book I did. And he's here in the room, and I don't embarrass him, but believe me, making books is not easy. And a few years ago, a publisher descended from heaven. His name is G, and he had the guts to print this book, which no one else would touch. And this is, once again, this is a smart little girl, and just simply, you know, that dioxin got to to her fetus in her mother's womb before she was born, and said, hey, you don't need that arm. And it's that simple. And this is a great, great, great kid. who is one of the smartest kids I've ever met. She was born born with no arms, and she's writing her name and address for me here. And 2 years later, when I went back, she was on the computer, tapping away with those toes. It's just, and those pictures are in the book. Maybe it's the next picture. Ah, here we are. And it's just overwhelming. And she's so smart. There's nothing they can't do. And this was another kid who was begging on the streets. This is actually in Cambodia over the border, because the Americans, although they denied it for many, many years, they were actually spraying Cambodia as well. And this is obviously a very sad case, because he has to be fed and looked after and things. But once again, he was learning English, and these are not stupid kids, although mental retardation often happens. And here's another kid who wants to well, play the guitar, I suppose. And now we're on a slightly new subject, a new subject, and this is the fact that a lot of Amerasian children were left behind by the Americans, and this is a girl that happened to have a picture of her father. This story was published in Life magazine. I got lots of calls late at night in really hushed tones from wives saying, that picture on page 43, I think it's my husband's. She's got his eyes. How do I get in touch with her? So virtually none of these children were taken back by the father to America. And it's extraordinary in a place, like down in the Delta in the south of Vietnam, you'd come across totally Caucasian-looking kids. And the reason for the crowd, by the way, is they thought I'd come to steal him because he's valuable. And what would happen would be that he was being looked after by foster parents. And if he could have been persuaded, a rich family would take him to the American embassy, and automatically the whole family would get visas to go to America. And of course, because all he had to say was, this is my family. And they just would, it was an automatic procedure. And then, of course, when they got to America, they would just dump the kid. And a lot of money would change hands. So when I turned up, wow, did they run fast. But once it was explained, and he's still in the village, he's still there. The Vietnamese always had a great toleration towards, despite what you read in the so-called expert books, they've always had a great toleration for tolerance for mixed race because of the French influence. So they're not pretty treated. And even this girl, who was the same age as all the other girls, obviously had a black father. Because they're not in Saigon, this is a small town way down in the Delta, she was one of the kids. And no one made fun of her, she didn't feel ostracized in any way. And when I had nothing else to do, I'd always hang out at the airport in Ho Chi Minh City, as it's now called, in Saigon. And this was the good father that came home to get his son, and that's the mother on the right there. And I think, for me, that whole sort of racist attitude. I had so many arguments. Well, Phil, they're half American. I said, yeah, but they're half Vietnamese. And what makes you think you've got sort of jurisdiction over them because they're half American. Well, you know, we can offer them so much more. You can offer them? I said, do you realize that if you actually sent all the kids, if you had all the kids in America adopted for 5 years in Vietnam, America would be a much, much better place. And now this is one of those pictures. It's never been published. And it is a picture of the 4 men who actually started the Vietnam War. Took a hell of a long time to track them down, and I found them, and this is the only picture that exists of all 4 of them together. At least, you know, I mean, maybe they took their own pictures, but these are the guys who actually officially fired the first shot of the Vietnam War. And what I can tell you is one of them looks remarkably like a Magnum photographer, the one on the right there. You can ask that question privately, which one? He's got a Scottish name. He does, doesn't he? Isn't it amazing? I couldn't believe it when I saw it. Previous life and all that. And this was a wonderful Viet Cong guy I met, somewhat addicted to alcohol, and that's him pointing at a picture. He just shot down an American helicopter. We put this, no other publisher would ever publish this picture, my God. It's a wonder they didn't burn the book in America. But you know, hey, you know, we did damage to each other. Sorry, we. You know, there was damage on both sides. And I always felt that, hey, you know, they took their own snaps, and he was rather proud of what he'd done. I got all the details, and I was able to check, because he got the dog tag of the pilot who was killed, and I was able to, you know, double check his story that it hadn't been photoshopped. And this guy on the right is Lee Tong Ba. Now, he was by far the most, he was by the most lauded South Vietnamese general. He appears in many books on the subject of the Vietnam War, and he's a very principled man, I have to say. He didn't run away in '75. He stood and took it on the chin. He spent 12 years in a re-education camp. And when I discovered he was being released, I took him, I said, look, his area of operation was to the west of Saigon. I said, why don't we go to the same area of operation and get him to meet his Viet Cong counterpart, who's the guy on the right, on the left, who is still alive. So we went and had a great lunch together, and at the end of the lunch I told my fixer, that's the guy with the glasses in the middle, says, why don't you tell each other who they are? You mean you're the man who betrayed your country for the Americans? No, they just confused us. But in the end, anyway, he's happily ensconced now in California, and probably has invited the Viet Cong guy over for his daughter's wedding. And I made a movie, I think it was about '89, I think, for the BBC on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and I found a truck driver who was still, and he was dying to show me how he almost got killed. His truck was on the road here, just where it is in the picture, and he stood proudly by his bomb crater. So, you know, it's a good film, actually. I mean, in the sense that it very much goes into, well, I know it goes into, you know, what happened. I bring in a lot of the war and everything else, and the reason I know it's a good film is that when PBS showed it in America, it was called the Great Journey series, and they didn't even look at the film before transmitting it. And both in Florida and in Texas, they tried to burn down the PBS stations the next morning. So I felt I struck a chord, as you might say. And those of you who go to Vietnam frequently on your holidays will recognize Ha Long Bay. But the interesting bit about Ha Long Bay is not the tourist trap of the bay, but you go a little bit further north, across the ferry, and you're in this area, which is the coal mining area. And of course, being Welsh and all that, that's where I head for. And it's extraordinarily sort of physical, the work they do. I'm sure by now they've probably got machines doing a lot of work, but certainly when I photographed there 10, 15 years ago, everything was manual. And there's always, there's something, well, let's say that it brings into focus that whole business of manual labor vis-a-vis coal and what it does to people, the way it kills them, but at the same time, there's something, I hate to use the word ennobling, but it's a bad word, but I think you know what I mean. There is, when you are collectively attempting to do something, there's a kind of bringing together, which is as old as mankind. And now we have the refugees. Of course, the whole business of I'll film these people are voting with their feet. Oh, I'm sorry. These people are voting on the boats by taking to the high seas to be killed in large numbers by Thai pirates and things. Well, I would say that probably 90% of the people who left Vietnam in this period, which is towards the end of the 70s and into the 80s, were in fact Chinese, not Vietnamese, and they ended up for the most part in refugee camps around Asia, and some, especially in Hong Kong, because they're Chinese in Hong Kong, so the Chinese know about other Chinese, so they kept them in those camps. In some cases, 10, 15 years, I think, and absolute misery. Well, the good news is, I suppose, that most of them are back now, and they've become very rich. And this is down in Malaysia, where another bunch went. And of course, everyone has to be photographed for their visa to get into America. And then I actually traveled with a family, leaving Vietnam to go and live in Orange County in California. And once again, there were many orgasmic moments. The first visit to an American supermarket, they thought they'd died and gone to heaven. And here's a guy with his daughter seeing his first sort of micro bikini. And on the beach somewhere in, probably Long Beach, I think, somewhere near Orange County anyway. And his daughters are now acclimatizing. And I spent quite a bit of time with this family, and the sort of process through which they became, they were, the pressures to become an American were quite extraordinary. And when you get people who have just moved, they're nervous, they're unsettled, they're not terribly clear what's going to happen next. They're getting a lot of contradictory evidence. That's when they're very vulnerable and can be manipulated. And I thought I'd pop this one in because there is something called the MIA issue, missing in action. There are still to this day people who believe that there are Americans held in cages like this, scattered all over, well, mostly Vietnam, Laos, and who knows, maybe a few in Cambodia. They really do believe this, so that every, is it the equivalent of our Armistice Day, that they put on demonstrations. This is actually in front of the Vietnamese embassy in Washington. And they have to find, well, men who preferably are dying of TB with big white beards to pretend to be GIs. And they carry them around in these bamboo cages. And I think once again, it's a book that is on this subject, but it's not a book on this. It's a book on, in the sense, what's wrong with, or the ease with which the American public are manipulated. And it's called MIA, myth-making in America. And it explains very clearly the way in which the MIA issue is used, and has been used, and still is used today, to essentially manipulate people. You know, it started off with the Republicans, then it goes to the Democrats, and it goes back to the, I mean, they're all in it. You know, I mean, they sell bracelets, for instance, 20 million bracelets at $10 each to sort of remember our boys who are still kept in captivity in Vietnam. They were never kept in captivity. I mean, if the whole thing was, I mean, was there 1 or 2 or 5 or 10? Yes, you know who they were? They were black soldiers who went AWOL, got up into the mountains with the Montagnards, said, wow, hey, these people are black too. The Vietnamese hate them. I'm going to hang out here. And snake wine is pretty good. And, you know, the occasional bit of buffalo. And in the meantime, you smoke marijuana and you have all the women you want because they don't believe in the usual stuff. And so they're very happy, and they live there. And why not? You know, I felt like going to join them on occasions. and then the wall came down. Russia collapsed. Up to this point, Russia was essentially bankrolling the Vietnamese economy. And suddenly, the Vietnamese are very pragmatic. And what are they going to do? Are they going to roll over and die? No. They said, hey, you know, we will accept American offer of largesse, you know, if we open up the country to foreign investment, you know, we'll survive. I mean, there were things like, I mean, the terrible embargo. I mean, the embargo. Do you remember Thatcher's role in all of that? America, who would say to a country, we are embargoing Vietnam. If you give them anything, we'll embargo you. So they were really on their knees. And they had some very bad problems with weather, floods and drought, you know, the usual problems. And so they kind of started to open up the country. And they went a bit crazy. And it was great for pictures. And, you know, the hoardings were darkening the countryside. And then now, you know, Vietnam is the second biggest exporter of coffee after Brazil. And I always love this picture because, you know, these are the pretty girls who are there pushing this thing. But if you look carefully in the middle there, you can see that no matter how stoic she looks, she's still being chatted up by some guy who wants her phone number. And of course, suddenly the whole country is covered in ads on the principle that more is better. And as it all became very visual for 2 or 3 years. And these guys who've been painting socialist realist paintings of communist triumphs will suddenly have to sort of turn their attention to bras, which I don't think they ever quite got right, but they certainly did their best. So suddenly, you know, all those foreign companies started going in there, and somebody puts up bus stops with the seats, so the people who still so much of, I mean, this is probably, no, it's not very old, this picture actually, maybe 10 years old now. But in those days, manual labor was very much how things were moved around the city. And this is just one of those point pictures. The Vietnamese thought that things were getting out of hand, So you couldn't use an English name for a bar. And so, of course, the inventor Vietnamese immediately came up with B475. And this is before the embargo was lifted, and there was a couple of Americans. And this is Vietnam's first jacuzzi. Historical in its own minor way, perhaps. And of course, I was lucky enough to, the salesman is explaining to this woman. The problem is when you don't pose pictures and the people stand in the right place, they don't believe me. But that's a sort of perfectly natural picture. They were very worried that I'd get them into trouble, so I had to promise them not to use the picture until the embargo was lifted. And the youth of Vietnam, there's enormous explosion. Over 50% of the population have been born since '75, and I think mostly to absorb some of these unemployed youth, they put them in the military, and they have them running around in the jungle, trying to, you never know when the next war might come, right? So they practice, and because this is the picture we would have loved to have taken during the war, but and they use all the same techniques as they used during the war with the Americans. But now things have changed. So these boys' fathers would be carrying shells on their shoulders down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and now fashion models in the new Vietnam, and the daughters are putting on rather erotic lunchtime dances in a supermarket. This is not a nightclub, but still, And this guy was very inventive. He did something that I suppose could even turn on someone at the Tate Modern. He actually took old Coca-Cola cans and turned them into helicopters, and they sell them to tourists in Vietnam, but they export them. And he's very proud of his accomplishments. And this is probably about 2002, I think, 2003. The hot item. And I have to tell you, for someone like me who went through that war, I just don't get it. The hot item was G.I. Joe, where you press the button, he wiggles his ass, singing God Bless America. He's got a hand grenade on his chest. He's got his M16 that killed vast numbers of Vietnamese. And, they've been snapped up by Vietnamese. Nowadays, of course, everywhere you go, you're offered souvenirs of the war that were made the night before. And this is in Khe Sanh, a very famous battle scene during the American War. And here they are celebrating the 25th anniversary of the end of the war. Well, there's been a change. And the famous tank, those of you who remember, the image that ended the war was Tank 843 going through the gates of the presidential palace, and that signaled the end of the Vietnam War. And the tank is probably only a couple of 100 meters from where this picture was taken, the real tank. But, you probably can't find a driver. So this is actually a Toyota truck with a cardboard tank stuck to it. And I thought in some ways, well, in some ways it did sort of represent the changes that are so monumental, because we're not talking here about some kind of a gradual thing. We're talking about a society which had values. It fought for something it believed in. It fought for social equality and all of that. And suddenly, a short time later, it's accepted all the values and morality of the people who are trying to kill them. I mean, it is an extraordinary thing. Now, does that mean that I personally, I mean, obviously on one level, you have to be shocked and disappointed. But, you know, things have changed, and the Vietnamese are becoming more independent. Well, there's still huge social problems, but can they pull it off? I think they can. Incredible scenes like this, which this is so much like Saigon in '68 or something. You know, this is Hanoi. What was 75, I think, when we were there. Sorry, 95. And the begging, you know, the destitution is so incredible. And the pressures on people moving to the cities, which is always the main way in which that was the actual. You see, the Americans depopulated the countryside and brought the people into the towns and cities. And they said it, you know, this is how we reconstruct their minds. This is how we turn them into consumers. This is how we get rid of those social values that have held them in such good state for 5,000 years. We have to reconstruct them. We have to get back to year zero. We bring them into the cities and turn them into different kinds of people. And but that was during the war. They used napalm and bombs to get them into the cities. Now it's pure pressure, because all that television, all that Sky shit from Murdoch is all persuading them to go into the cities, because that's where their future lies. And here they're living in a graveyard, simply because, you know, they're told if they keep the graves clean, there's no problem. And this girl had lived on this boat, and she'd found a piece of packing material from a refrigerator box, made a little raft, and that's how she gets to school every morning. I think once again, you know, those irrepressible Vietnamese. And Culture President once said it's more important to spend more money on shoe leather than it is on cameras. And he's absolutely right. So I do a lot of wandering around, you know, a lot of walking. And I came across what had been some kind of studio for building busts of Ho Chi Minh, the Vietnamese leader. And I got this picture, which I rather like. And these are sort of surplus to requirements, if you like. There's a in Vietnam, there's a youth paper, and they had a poll from their readers as to who the most famous person in the world was. They chose Bill Gates, not Ho Chi Minh. So the magazine was closed down for a month. And yeah, and then we almost come to the end. I was very lucky in about, it seems like 2 years ago, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I discovered that the first ever American military contingent, which happened to be sailors, was going to Da Nang, where, those of you who remember your history, that's where the Americans first landed in Vietnam, was at Da Nang. So I rushed down there, and this, you know, the Vietnamese, the communist flag and the American flag are flying together. And then I teamed up with this bunch of American sailors who were out for a night on the town, adopting what you might call the air-conditioned sort of posture for the night ahead. And I got into this bar where, you know, the young ladies, the nymphets of Nanang, whose mothers had serviced their fathers, were now doing the same thing. And that's, I believe, how I finished the book. So those are the pictures. So now lots of questions. Thank you very much. Just have to have a whiff of a Nyrin Bevan special. I am, having been treated in the most expensive hospitals in America and on the National Health in Britain, I have to tell you, you're the luckiest guys in the world. Don't believe anything the Daily Telegraph or the Daily Mail tells you.
We do have a microphone, so if anyone has a question, please raise your hand and stand as well. I think would be helpful. Okay, we'll go over here. The door closed.
Hello.
Hi.
Have you ever decided not to take a picture?
Yes. There was one occasion, I was in a hospital, and there was a kind of a ward where they put people to die. You know, people couldn't be. And I took one look at this kid, and he'd been napalmed. And he was halfway, he was probably about 9 years old, 7, 8, 9 years old. He was halfway to becoming a skull. His lips had gone, his eyelashes had, his nose had gone. You could see the bone underneath. But miraculously, he was still alive. And I said, I can't do this. This is obscene. I turned around, did something else, and I felt a tug on my shirt. He said, I took the picture. It's never been published. But I thought, well, if he can stand it, I can stand it. Now, that's a rather dramatic answer to your question. Are there times when I've not taken pictures? Obviously. You know, especially when you don't speak the language, you have to kind of, you have to respond to people in the sense what they're trying to tell you. And there are times when, you know, that sort of in your face with a wide angle, click, 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 and you know, that's, you have to respect the subject. And if they don't want to be, photographed, you know, you always know when they don't want to be photographed. You know when you're getting too close. You know when you're essentially interfering. Your presence is not constructive. And on those occasions when somebody says, well, Phil, you know, if you want to choose between saving a soldier's life and taking a picture, which would you choose? And this is a valid question, because, you know, there are people who say, oh, your photography, take the picture. I say, if you have to ask that question, you know, it's totally and utterly insulting. I mean, it's not a question you can ask. You obviously saved the person. Because why are you there? You're there because you care. You're there to do something positive. And then, of course, just to make them smile, I say, but if you have to carry the stretcher, always use your left hand so you can still shoot with your right.
Hi there.
Hi.
I remember sort of almost 20 years ago when I was a young, slightly out of photographer, endlessly watching the BBC documentary about Magnum. At the end of it, the very last bit of the third episode, you were having an argument with all the other Magnum photographers about how you would shoot every picture you'd ever taken in your life without any film in the camera. Would you still do that? Do you think that's still the case?
Yeah, well, I tell you, one of the things about being around Magnum is it does make you think sort of tangentially sometimes and come up with such remarks. I think what I was probably trying to say, but you know what these editors are like, they cut out the last bit. What I was trying to say was, look, you know, there are various reasons for being a photographer. There was a list of reasons. And suddenly, the experiences I've had, and it would be obscene not to have film in the camera, but the experience, but had there been no film in the camera, I would still elect to do the same thing again. Because essentially what the reason you do all of this is you want to learn. You know, I'm a born skeptic, cynical perhaps, and I never believe anything unless I see it for myself. And that little box around your neck gives us this incredibly privileged opportunity to see it for ourselves. And it's something we could never, I mean, people take it so lightly. It's in fact, we are up there with the gods in terms of the opportunities we have to check things out. And frankly, the more you check it out, the more you understand, the more you understand, the more you are able to check it out correctly the next time and so forth. It's an upward spiral. And that's why everyone in this room should be a photographer. But obviously there's another side to it. And the side is you communicate what you've seen. And that means putting film in the camera.
Hi there. Do you think with the sort of the way that the military control access for photographers now, there's any chance of anyone at the moment making like an Iraq ink or an Afghanistan ink or doing anything similar, a groundbreaking book that sort of changes public opinion to the degree that yours did?
The short answer is yes, and I'll explain to you why. There are obstacles, and guess what? Great photographers love obstacles. You've got something to fight against, you've got to get around, you've got to hone your techniques of getting stuff. I think that things are beginning to, I'm not minimizing, and I've never been embedded. I wouldn't on principle ever be embedded. I joke that, I would never be embedded. However, some great work has come out of both Afghanistan and Iraq. And of course, I'm told by colleagues that the censorship which they have to agree to is not as strictly imposed as it was. Probably for one of the same reasons happened in Vietnam. As that war carried on in Vietnam, more and more soldiers gave me tips, gave me information, right? I didn't have to sort of try to work, try to get in there myself. They tipped me off, because they were becoming anti-war. And the same thing is happening in Iraq and Afghanistan. There is, I believe, a great movement against the war. They're demoralized. The politicians don't believe in the war. The officers don't believe. All the men don't believe. I mean, it filters down. Of course, some do. There's some gung-ho crazies in every army. But in general, I think it's probably a little bit easier to work than it was. Obviously, what is really difficult, is to sort of wander around, looking like we do with our Western clothes and cameras. And I think it would just be terribly embarrassing to be kidnapped. And they ask Magnum for £1 million, and Magnum says, well, we can afford 5,000. So, and also, we've had some really great work that's come out of Afghanistan and Iraq by Magnum photographers. There's no question about it. But to get back to my point, I'm not as despondent about the way photography is going in terms of getting the picture, because I think ultimately passion is what counts, and passion and inventiveness and overcoming obstacles is what drives people to do great work.
Hi, Philip. Mike Dodds, cameraman during the 60s, 70s, been to Vietnam. Just talking about stills and photojournalism. We've lost Life magazine, we've lost Picture Post, Funny Times doesn't want to do it, The Observer doesn't want to do it. Most American magazines don't really take photojournalism that seriously. I mean, where do all the young people who are great camera people, great photographers, how do they get their name in the press? How do they actually make it work?
Well, my view may be a little skewed because I've been the judge of a competition run by a Japanese magazine. Great story. Japanese photographer, all the problems you just mentioned. He starts his own magazine, Days Japan. It's dedicated to photojournalism. And guess what? The amount of material that I see, I'm high for a month afterwards. Now, if you're saying where does it get published, hey, you know, I was saying to somebody earlier, in the old days in Russia, when they didn't want you to find out what was going on, they burned the books or sent you to the gulag. What they do here, they drown you. You're drowning in 250 billion images on the internet. And that's a huge problem. So how do you deal with that? Well, I suppose you find a publisher and you do a book. And I think that we're in a stage, we're in a transitionary stage. Nobody knows quite much about the future, but we're certainly in a stage where people are looking at those pictures and seeing them, and some of them get out. However, if I wanted to depress you all, which I will in a second, somebody did research 2 weeks ago, published research from 2 weeks ago. They studied from the beginning of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. They tabulated all the photographs that appeared on the front page of the Washington Post and the New York Times on Iraq and Afghanistan. 3% showed anything that was anything to do with violence, anything to do with the real cost of war, anything to do with human suffering. 3%. And that's the two major newspapers in America. So yeah, you know, we're censored. We are, it's not some sort of accident. It's not that the readers demand yet another bloody way to cook spinach in their magazines. It is a deliberate ploy, in my opinion, to essentially keep us infantilized so that we don't know what's really going on. And hey, we're not all infantilized. You know, some of us are smarter than that. And when I say some of us, a huge number of people in America who are often dismissed as having been dumbed down are not dumbed down. They know what's going on, and that's why, well, there is such a huge opposition to that war. But you're quite right, but you're quite right in saying that it looks grim out there. But you know, what was it like 30 or 40 years ago? There were guys who, you know, learned how to use an exposure meter. They got a job with Life magazine. They got an annual salary. They went off around the world taking pictures. And we've never heard of them or seen the pictures since. You know, because they were not motivated. They were not passionate. Believe me, if you want to do something important in Iraq or Afghanistan today, you've got to be committed. You've got to have a fire in your belly. And it's that fire that counts. Because ultimately, that work will come out. That work will be seen. And even if it's not seen immediately, even if it goes into that historical context category, it will be there, and it will be, you made your contribution. And I think that, you know, I see the glass half full.
Hi, Philip. The question is about what you just mentioned about the 3% of images that are run on the front pages of newspapers in the United States, and that show violence. And obviously, at some point, there was a turning point where, if you think back to Somalia and the footage that came out of Somalia, when do you think that turning point was? I mean, was it sort of the recent Iraq? Was it the first Iraq? In your opinion?
Well, you know, there are. I would say it was a drift. I mean, the notable, the first. It all started with the press lost the war for us in Vietnam. Bullshit. Absolutely untrue. The first war that they really implemented that mindset was Grenada, where we were all kept away. Once again, not all of us. One of our photographers, you know, was in a boat that was being swamped by helicopter blades, and he would have drowned had they not turned back. You know, so they really try to keep people away. Then in Panama, it was lessened perhaps a little tiny bit, and then the first Gulf War, they didn't know. They were just unprepared. They didn't know how to handle it. The best stuff from the first Gulf War came from essentially people who were not embedded, not even with the military. They just drove around in their own vehicles, and with the ensuing danger. And then for this war, Jesus, they suddenly said, hey, we're going to welcome the press. Because somebody in Washington said, hey, we can control them. You know, you forget it. If you embed them, they start to like the people they're with. Hey, and that's true. I'm first to admit that. Why? We're human. If we were stuck with a dozen guys for a week, we start to like them. It would be inhuman if we didn't like them, because you're sharing the same danger. So we'll do that, and we'll have them running up and down hills in Washington with cast iron boots on and bits of heavy metal in their rucksacks, and we'll make them crawl through the mud, and we'll fire bullets over their heads, and we'll do all of that, and then they'll be qualified to be embedded with a unit. And I remember one photographer saying she'd been with a unit for sort of 3 weeks, and absolutely nothing had happened. And then suddenly, you know, half a mile away, there's an incredible firefight. And she said, I've got to photograph it. And the guy says, if you go, you're not coming back. So so what's happening, has been happening with embedding, has been very, very effective in essentially censoring things. And the censorship goes beyond human reason. You know, it was illegal to photograph empty caskets covered in flags arriving at the Air Force Base in America with presumably, with dead soldiers in there. I mean, there was no identification, there was no nothing. They were just, you know, but you know, some guy with a point and shoot took a picture, so we all saw the pictures. But I mean, it was the most extraordinary attempt to bamboozle the public, and we will succeed in the end. And who would have thought? Who would have thought? After all that amazing hard work the professional journalists did, it was some ridiculous guy with a point and shoot digital camera that produced those Abu Ghraib pictures that changed everything.
Okay, there's one man down.
Hey Philip, it's Marcus down in the cheap seats.
You should be on a throne, mate.
Yeah, whatever. I think you are. It looks very comfortable.
It is actually. I'm hoping to take it home with me.
I'm sure we can wrap a whip round. I think we've all kind of seen your images, and we've all, as photographers, grown up respecting them. And I think there are many photographers here that are photographers because of your images and because of what you've done in the past. And maybe you could share with us a little bit more about maybe one or two of your images. I know maybe some photographers here, they remember their best, in inverted commas, images that they've taken, and they remember those days and you know what surrounded that image. So maybe if you could, for example, the last image that you have in the Vietnam Ink book, the woman's bandaged around her face, carrying the tag. If you could maybe explain a little bit what was going on before that and a little bit what was going on after that, just your experience of that day and that time and what you were feeling at the time.
Well, I think I told you about the tag and the significance of the tag. I won't repeat that. But certainly, I think I was filled with the most extraordinary anger. And in those sort of couple of weeks, I was in Quang Ngai, which is the name of the town. And the province hospital was in Quang Ngai. Now, Quang Ngai was an area where it had been solidly Viet Minh during the French time, and now it was solidly Viet Cong. And the Americans went in there and essentially behaved very badly. I mean, I don't want to bore you with details, but it was only about 6-7 years ago that some enterprising journalists in Ohio discovered that a lot of the people who fought, a lot of the soldiers who fought in that area came from Ohio, and he tracked them, a lot of them down, who were all in mental homes and cracking up, and the ones that hadn't committed suicide and so forth. And he built up an extraordinary picture of the violence that took place on a very personal level. There was bombing and shelling and so forth, but there was a huge amount of violence, interpersonal violence. In fact, the picture, the one I mentioned about the Sachi, the guy, that was in that area. It was a very, very dangerous area. And what happened was that each morning, the lucky ones that were still alive and could be moved were brought to the province hospital. And if anything gave lie to the fact, we are here, Phil, to look after the Vietnamese people, that hospital was the place to see it. There was one solitary Spanish surgeon there. He was so busy, he got annoyed when he saw me photographing this kid. He'd put his arm back on and he'd put it on the wrong way, so his palm was pointing out. That guy every morning went around and he decided who would live and who would die. He knew he could never ever operate on all of them, so he just went for the ones that he thought he had a chance with, and the rest were basically just left to die. And there were 200 yards away, 300 yards away, there was a sort of huge American sort of bar where all the Americans living in Quai Nai would go drinking all day and most of the night. And it was, to me, it was such a vivid example of the truth of what America was actually doing in at least that area. And I would duplicate it in other places, obviously, but I saw that firsthand. And I don't know, I just hung out there. And I suppose you might say the closest I've ever come to believing there may be someone up there is that it's frame 37A. And I have one frame. And then, of course, things move quickly, and I click, rewind the old Nikon, and I got the picture. But I tell you, that's good. When I look at that contact sheet, I get goose pimples, and because it was, because a second later she'd gone. They're very fluid things. Well, photography in general is very fluid, obviously, but in that particular case, a lot of people being pushed around and trying to get the attention of a nurse or a doctor or someone to help them. Yeah. So I think. Well, I don't want to get, I don't want to start, but I'm very proud of the fact that I'm a great believer that a photographer who gets emotional is as useless as a surgeon who faints at the sight of blood. You've got to, but there again, I sometimes dream about using automatic focus cameras so you can focus with tears in your eyes and still get sharp pictures. But then it was all done manually, and you had to keep that eye very dry and clear. And the time to break down and get wet shirts is in the darkroom or when you're editing. I think it's so important to keep a clear head and to be able to stand all of that stuff. And I'm very proud of the fact that you see things that are so awful. I mean, you said mothers picking up bits of children and babies. I mean, things that are supposed to drive you, well, insane, or at least to landscape photography. Sorry. Oh no, I do apologize. Look, he's my best friend. We had tea this afternoon, and it's, it's a free. People do what they want. But anyway, the thing is that I only once sort of started to pass out. I was doing a story for Look magazine on something called an inflatable hospital, and it was mostly happening at night. They would take this hospital, pump it up, and have it near the battlefield, so they had less distance to bring, people who'd been severely wounded. And they brought this guy in, and they got the old drill out and started drilling a peg out of his brain, and the guy's got his finger feeling inside, and the other guy says, "Oh shit, man, it's his leg, not his head." He'd misread, and I felt myself going, "Oh," whoop. And I managed to get my head between my legs, so I never passed out. But that was the only single incident in those 3 years, and I can't explain it, you know. Jesus, I cry at most movies I see. But still, I really had that, I believe, determination that you're useless. You let it get to you. You channel all that anger. You channel it into your fingertip, and you try and get it. You try and record it. That's ultimately what it's all about. And you know, there's plenty of time. And why don't I get nightmares? Everybody says about film, how about post-traumatic stress syndrome? I said, I know what you're talking about. I've never had a bad dream about Vietnam or Cambodia. Every night I go to sleep, as soon as my head hits the pillow, I'm back there every night, and everything's perfect. You know, compositions are great. Cameras never break down. FedEx never loses the film. And I wake up with a smile on my face. And I can't explain it. I can't explain it. I know I'm not supposed to behave like that according to the textbooks, but I don't know.
There's a question here.
Oh.
I just wondered, when you revisited Vietnam after all the war pictures, how many of your subjects asked you for photographs, and if you ever did send pictures back to them and stuff?
Well, the people do ask for pictures, yes, but you know, there's a sort of a transitionary period in which, after the war ended, I took, I can remember well, we would try to get 50 packs of Polaroid through London Airport when it's been transcript by Polaroid from America for me to pick up at the airport, not pay customs, so I can take it to Vietnam. So I had a Polaroid camera with me. So I photographed lots and lots of people. I went through those 50 packs very quickly. So that was in the very, very early days. But as time passed, you know, one of the first things that people have a real need for after restaurants is a photo shop, because they, a shop, you know, they're selling pictures. So that it's very, very common to find people having pictures. And you'd be surprised just how cheap. I'll put it this way, you'd be surprised of the profit margins for Fuji and Kodak in the West compared to Asia. So that it becomes very, very affordable. And then at one point I was using a camera made by, I still like the camera actually, it's made by Minolta. It was a really awful thing. They put a big screen on the back, but it wasn't a digital camera. And that's when I got into real trouble, because I could hear them say, "Oh, digital, digital." And I take my picture, I'd take a picture, and then they'd all rush to see the picture on the back, and there's no picture there. All you had on the screen was the ASA and, you know, how many pictures you had left on the roll. Oh, they were so disgusted in Vietnam. What fakery is going on here? But I think we've gone through that stage now of if you're saying, do I send pictures, prints to people? Yeah, sure. But you know, they're people I used to know from before. They're people I got to know since. You know, I have fixers and drivers, people who know what's going on, and you know, I take pictures of them, sure, and I send them prints. We have a lady here, I believe.
Do you think, compared to the old days of the Second World War or Korean War or Vietnam War, do you think now is much more easy to manipulate journalist and photographer who covers the war?
Well, you know, there's never been any true empiric evidence on that. I think that what has changed is that if you talk about World War II, the Korean War, the mood was such that it would have been sort of almost impossible to believe that someone like Kappa would have done anything other than the, I use the word loosely, party line. In other words, the line of the people he was with. It was so totally normal that there was nothing that ever appeared that contradicted. You know, David Douglas Duncan's Korean War could have been used as ads for recruitment, in the sense that we knew everybody seemed to know whose side we were on, as it were. But I think that as, you know, wars of national liberation came around, the situation becomes a little bit more confused, and as a result, the individual journalists, are not as easily manipulated. You know, they're not, as they put it in the military, they're not part of the team as they were in World War II and the Korean War. And now, of course, I think many journalists and photographers, well, I think there's a constant probably attempts to weed them out as being non-team players.
Thanks for such a wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you, you talked a lot about us looking at them and your voice as the middle person. And I just wondered, I'd like if you could just say something about them looking at themselves and those pictures back in Vietnam and the way they carry a memory for them too. And I suppose especially in relation to that last thought that you left us with, that idea of the Nimfets who are carrying out the same acts in a sense as their mothers did with the fathers, and that kind of cycle of history and the way your photographs are a memory.
Yeah, no, there's one little tiny bit I've missed there. Which one picture were you referring to, a situation?
The last one you left us with, of the Nimfets with the GIs,
Ah.
the Marines, and
Oh, I
the
see.
idea of the cycle that is
The cycle, indeed, the Confucian
Or is it,
cycle.
I suppose, is
Yeah.
it in the sense of your photographs presumably being a memory for them too?
Yeah, well, I think that you know, well, the Vietnamese I've met and have pretty close relationships with are people who, you know, they can be divided into sort of three classes, I suppose. The ones who are anxious to learn about what's going on, those that sort of know what's going on or what went on, and are very interested and concerned about, you know, for instance, there's a certain age group now that I come across in Hanoi who are very anxious to know, you know, does he really do that? Did they, you know, they're very, very keen. And then there's the older group who actually went through it themselves, and they're, you know, they're party members for the most part. They're people who are inclined to accept and obey and toe the line. So, you know, we don't want to piss off the Americans. You know, we don't want to endanger our economic development by harping to the past. The joke is that the museum and this is a journalist joke, the museum in Saigon that used to be called the Museum of American War Crimes has now been renamed the Museum of the Great Misunderstanding. And there is that tendency to sort of pragmatically live with the changes, with what's going on. So now, on a more personal level, you know, I'm the first to acknowledge that the pictures of these rather large gentlemen in white suits dancing with almost children is something that we in the West here find very offensive. And I'm not suggesting that the Vietnamese who don't share our views are somehow inferior. But I suppose in a society where the disparity between the rich and the poor, or the overwhelmingly poor people, the possibility a beautiful daughter it becomes an enormous asset to the family. And frankly, you know, if she's joining the oldest profession in the world, it doesn't sort of really upset them too much. There's a pragmatic attitude towards that kind of thing that well, I would claim is present in every country in the world, but there it's a bit more obvious. And also, I don't think that you know, prostitution in the more obvious sense of the word is really the goal. The goal in many cases is to find sort of stability. And believe me, if you were to fall in love with one of those girls and marry her, you're not marrying her, you're marrying a very large family. And you're responsible for that whole family. And that's another economic incentive to, in fact, make sure that she makes a very wise choice. In fact, she would never fall back in love with you and marry you unless she got the approval of a very large number of people. So I think those are some of the differences between our society and theirs.
Philip, sorry. Two questions, a bit different, but you were talking about Iraq earlier on, and isn't it funny how this circularity is happening also in Iraq at the moment, where we see that the Americans are paid the Sunnis, and they relax because obviously there are less deaths than what you know, would have been used to, but of course they're ready to leave the country again in the hands of the Sunnis, basically in the same situation in which they arrived.
They found it, indeed.
In a slightly different way, of course, than Vietnam, but this is sort of first, if you could talk to us about it. Second thing is about the journalist and the role of journalists. This war and these last few years basically is the first time in which all the intermediaries, whether they're journalists or human or you know NGOs, people that are on the battlefields to help, basically are targets, and the Americans have sort of almost created the conditions to for this to happen. In that sense, what is the future? Is it only the local journalists that will be able to operate in this scenario? Because it's more really than just the outlets to which to show the picture.
Yeah. Well, to go to the first one, I think I still remember it. You know, I'm not an expert, but suddenly, you know, the twists and turns and the sort of the fight in Iraq between the American optimists and the American pragmatists has meant that they've essentially, well, look, the truth is they screwed up on such a level, as you'd expect from, you know, a group of people who ran this war in Washington who have only one thing in common, and that's a low IQ. And so they've really screwed up. In terms of who can photograph, the fact that civilians, people who look like us, are targets means that there's been a great flourishing of local photographers, especially, and journalists, who were able to get around and get the stuff. And there's one notorious case at the moment where one photographer who undoubtedly had good contacts on both sides is now, I think, on his way to Guantanamo, on the grounds that, you know, he somehow has not, as it were, you know, been loyal enough to the AP. So those kind of, I think, problems really mean that the locals are doing a very good job. And I mean, I wish I knew more about the sort of details of you know, the actual day-to-day workings. I think that the best photography that's coming out right now, and has been for the last couple of years really, has come from local photographers.
Yeah, I think we've got time for one more question.
I'm Justin here, wants to ask a question.
Yeah, sure. Your photographs are incredible, and a wonderful talk tonight. I'll say that again. His photographs are incredible, and a wonderful talk tonight. Such elegance and wit. One thing that does intrigue me in a way is have you is one of the things that might keep you awake at night. A feeling that when you take such brilliant photographs, that they do in some way glamorize war, and after a time they become, as you were saying, you were always searching for the iconic image. Well, if we think of the iconic images of Goya's drawings, for example, or Picasso's Guernica, do you ever feel that the passion is in long-term danger of sinking back into rather an aesthetic thing?
Yes. Definitely, and I suppose that I have a problem. Since I was a little boy in chapel, as that preacher moved backwards and forwards in the pulpit relative to the cross behind him, as a 3-year-old I had to keep moving to keep the composition right. I got slapped a lot for fidgeting. And I'm born with this. I mean, any woman that I've ever had a meal with will say I drive you crazy because I'm always doing this. And they think, who's there? You know, and all I'm trying to do is to get the composition to work. So I find that ultimately, if I look through my pictures, they have what you would call an aesthetic sort of quality to do with good old-fashioned getting it right in the frame. Getting it right in the frame so that it looks, you know, it works as a picture. Now, what does that mean? As the rest of the world, and a good percentage of Magnum, are in fact saying composition doesn't count. You know, the more blurs, the more sort of heads coming in and out of frames and sloping horizons. You know, that's dynamism or something, right? Now the problem is that the more people embrace that kind of photography, the more I start to look like dinosaur. Now, on a purely practical level, as you might say, that something happens, and that is that, and without sounding self-congratulatory, I think real people like real pictures, and the reason they go to Florence for their holidays and not Huddersfield is because, hey, the buildings in Florence are actually quite beautiful by comparison. And I think that people still have, although I doubt it sometimes, an aesthetic sense. So therefore, I make no bones about it. You know, I need a new computer. They're not free. I don't want to do a deal with Apple to you know, I don't want to get tied up in all that promotion nonsense. So I need the money. And how do I get the money? Some kid who saw my picture in the Sunday Times 30 years ago now wants to buy a print. And they want a print to put on the wall because it means something to them. And it has a sort of, yeah, you know, an aesthetic quality. And so if you're right, I mean, there's the elevation of that kind of my kind of to art. And yeah, look, let's be perfectly reasonable. I wouldn't want my pictures hanging on my bedroom wall. I don't have one hanging there. But, you know, every now and again, somebody who was turned on, who saw something, you know, they want to own that print. And maybe they hang it, you know, in the spare room. But I think that is happening. What, of course, is unconscionable is you take a 25-year-old photographer who only photographs prints to sell in galleries. This seems to me a total abjugation of what photography is all about. You go there, you see the world, you make a statement, you try and get it right, you understand, you produce that image, that iconic or not. But and then, hey, when you're an old man, sure, if somebody wants to buy it, you sell it. But the idea of actually producing photography for a gallery at an early age seems to me quite obscene. Well, thank you. Thank you.